Coming up in today's podcast.
A good point you make about people who are not even Christian, because Sarah wasn't religious at all. She was like born and raised an atheist, and her parents were atheists, and even her grandparents. Like, there was no religion in that family at all. And so it wasn't like they were motivated by some better version of religion. It's just that they could see that injustice had been done, and they strongly believed in doing the right thing. And so there doesn't need to be a religious motivation for being a good person. And you don't need to be religious in any way to recognize how messed up the brethren are. Yeah, like what greater motivation is there than just being a good person without any hope of reward for it?
Welcome to the Get a Life podcast. Explore survivor stories. Uncover the hidden truths. Join our X-Cult conversations. You matter, and so does your story.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life for part 3 of Craig Hoyle's book, Excommunicated. I'm Cheryl, and joining me again today is Craig and Lindy. We are all ex-members of the Exclusive Brethren, now known as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. Welcome, Craig and Lindy.
Good to be back.
If you haven't watched podcast 125 and 126, you'll want to start there before you watch today's. Today, we are journeying into the last chapters that dive into Craig's experiences after leaving the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. So I am going to hand it over to you, Craig, and we can jump right into chapter 13.
Thanks, Cheryl. So we're picking up with the latter third of the book here, which is, as you said, talking about life after leaving the Brethren. And chapter 13 is a shorter chapter, but it deals with the media attention that happened after I came out of the Brethren. So I was withdrawn from in October 2009, and then it was just a few weeks later, really, I was first approached by a journalist about telling my story. And I don't think I would ever have anticipated when I came out what impact sharing my story would have. And I agreed to it, not because there was any big plan, but because I knew that what had happened to me was still happening to other people in the Brethren. And I thought then, and I still think, that it's really important that those of us who have a voice and can speak out do stand up and say what's happening and speak that truth. Because for every one of us who can speak up, there's another 10 or even 100 who can't. The beginning of chapter 13 deals with me telling my story to 60 Minutes. And this was an interesting process because they also talked to my grandpa, Grandpa George. And so Sarah Hoyle was the reporter who interviewed me. And I think she was quite indignant about what had happened. And she'd come from a family that, she had gay cousins, and she'd seen what their lives had been like, and her family had always been really supportive. And she, I think, really struggled to get her head around the fact that anyone could do this to a member of their family just because they were gay. And I think if we just skip over the 60 Minutes part, because a few months later I filmed a similar story in Channel 7 with Jackie Quist, and this one was much more dramatic. Channel 7 wanted to track down Mark Craddock, the doctor who had prescribed the hormonal suppressants. I won't read through the transcript of what happened with Dr. Craddock, because we can just attach the video here and people can see it for themselves, and I think that's actually more powerful. But we'll pick up a little bit later than that. So we'd had the confrontation with Dr. Craddock by this point, and we had decided to go and film outside the main Brethren Hall in Sydney, so we'll pick up the story there. A few hours later, I arrived with the film crew at the main Brethren Hall in Ermington. We discovered a meeting was in progress. Hundreds of vehicles were parked across the yard in neat rows, and a security guard patrolled the gates. He spoke into his lapel microphone as Mitch, that's the cameraman, began unloading his camera. When Jackie asked the guard if we could join the service, he said he would need to check with internal security. There was no reply when I buzzed the intercom. 10 minutes later, the doors of the hall swung open. Crowds of brethren emerged through them, and I began pointing out which ones I knew. When Dr. Craddock walked out, Mitch zoomed in. The main gates slid open almost immediately, and marshals were stationed at each entrance to direct traffic. It was just as I remembered. A stream of vehicles poured through, face after familiar face flashing past. A few glanced at me briefly, then looked away as though I was a stranger. Could these really be the same people I remembered so fondly from just a year earlier? One of the traffic marshals caught my eye, and I realized he was a cousin of mine. Pain, betrayal, and anger flashed across his face. My phone rang, and I scrambled to fish it out of my pocket. It was Dad, calling from New Zealand. He was furious with me, having heard I was attacking the Holy Fellowship in Sydney. My reply was caught on camera. So I'm playing into the hands of the devil and doing the devil's work. All I'm doing is telling the truth to show exactly what it's like. Dad berated me and demanded I come back under his authority as the head of the household. When he realized I was still with the TV crew, he began dictating a message to them. I told him he may as well speak to the reporter directly and handed the phone to Jackie. Dad told her that I needed to find the Holy Spirit and let God work in me to bring about a change. She disagreed and took a different tack. She acknowledged how hard the situation must be for the family, then asked Dad whether he still loved me as his son and could find it in his heart to accept me as I was. Dad broke down in tears. Overcome with emotion and weeping again myself, I felt a flash of pity. I knew this must be torturing him and how the brethren would condemn him for failing as a father. Before hanging up, I once again reminded Dad, "You have done what you believe is right, regardless of the cost, and now I'm doing the same." If we just pause it there, I think it's really important to acknowledge that when you speak out after leaving the brethren, it does come at a cost, and it does have an impact on your family on the inside. And certainly for me and for both of you too, I'm sure there's blowback from family on the inside, and they try and shut us down, and they try and tell us not to talk about what happened in there. And for me, I really struggled for a while with the attempted guilt tripping of that. To me, it was a real discrepancy. They were willing to cast me out and cut me off and sort of throw me to the wind because they didn't agree with my choices. But as soon as I did anything on the outside that made them feel bad or that they felt reflected poorly on the family or on the brethren, they immediately tried to make me feel guilty for living my truth. And so it's always been really important to me to really strongly make that point that the brethren are living their truth regardless of the consequences it has on us. And so every single one of us has the right to do the same.
Yeah. That was so beautifully put. Yeah.
Yeah, you're totally right, Craig, that when the brethren always, of course, prefer that if people are going to fall off the back of the bandwagon or get shoved off the bandwagon, that they would just die quietly and without a fuss. Yeah, and then in their view as well, they call that, the people who do that, who remain quiet for whatever reason, they say, oh, they're not bitter and they've moved on and that kind of thing. It's that whole classic thing of then, they say if you speak up, oh, well, you're bitter, that word that the brethren use, which funnily enough, I think it's Jehovah's Witnesses use the same word to describe people who speak up about them, which again is interesting that, similar language is used. And yet, it may not be that you're bitter. It doesn't mean that you haven't forgiven them or that you don't love them. But as you said, it's, for those of us who do choose to speak up, it's because, we feel so strongly that something is wrong here and we can see the vulnerabilities and the harm that is still happening in an ongoing way. And we're the ones who choose to go, actually, I can't just get on with my own life here. I have to do something about this. I know for me, it was, I spent many years getting on with my own life, building my own life. And then it was in particular when my brother and then my father were kicked out that I realized, oh my goodness, I've sort of wanted to kid myself that the brethren aren't still doing this to people. I've sort of, wanted to just forget about it, but realizing that, wow, they are still currently excommunicating people, and that people's families are still getting split up, all the same old stuff is currently happening. I was like, man, I just can't sit back and do nothing. And yeah, I'm sure for both of you there were similar catalysts of that wrestle of, do I just keep being quiet and focusing on building my own life, or actually do I need to be one of the ones who tries to do something about this?
The change that we want to happen by exposing all this stuff doesn't come, it does get messy, right? It doesn't come like with, sunshines and unicorns and rainbows. It is going to be messy, and that's okay. That is completely okay for things to get messy.
How does that saying go? Paraphrasing, but all that is needed for evil to succeed is for good people to say nothing.
Yes, exactly. Right. Like I went on with my life for 30 years, right? I mean, same thing, kept quiet, put my head down and just did my thing. I think the audio, I found that the audio of Richard's chasing that went on and the documentary that happened, the Breaking Brethren, that was it for me, because previously I had a conversation with my parents and I had heard a bunch of this drug stuff that was happening. And I actually phoned them to see, like, are you guys aware of what actually goes on in there? And I had no plans to say what had happened to me, right? Like it was a very sensitive subject. It was just one of those things that I just, you have to really be careful of who you confide in with that kind of stuff, because it just takes you to a very vulnerable position. And the conversation got so escalated when I'm trying to explain to them that what happens out here also happens in there, but it's isolated. And the conversation escalated and escalated and escalated till I literally just screamed out what had happened to me. And I think it shocked them, but at the same time, there was no reception back, right? You get the same kind of reception like Craig, you would have got from your dad of that, well, God's going to take care of it. You give it to the Lord. This will all be taken care of. Just come home. We'll figure this out. But that's not how foundations change, right? We don't just sit by and hand things over. Yes, you can have faith that things are going to take care of themselves, but that doesn't mean that all of us stay idle and not do or say anything, right? Like we all have to have that part where we're standing up and vocalizing, hey, this isn't right. Because they sincerely, I think a lot of the grassroots brethren really don't understand how much really is happening, right? And by exposing this, like I've been talking to an insider who got his parents to start watching the Get a Life podcast just by him. He wanted to inform them. And he was shocked. They were open to it. And so now they're watching the Get a Life podcast.
Welcome to whoever you are.
Right?
People shouldn't be afraid of doubts and questions and the truth. If they've got nothing to hide, they shouldn't be afraid of listening to these things, because they'll be able to say, oh, well, no, that's lies because here's the evidence fact or whatever. Yeah. Like they shouldn't really be so threatened and so afraid of some of these things coming out. But I also wanted to jump back to that thing that Craig said about, I think one of the things that's really hard is that they then do this this emotional kind of reaction thing of saying you don't love us or you will, and kind of use that guilt tripping to make you feel really guilty for speaking up. I know that, I've had that a lot, and I can understand, in their framework, because they're so enmeshed with the brethren, their individual lives and their family lives are so enmeshed with the brethren that there's sort of no separation. And so for them, if you speak up about bad practices in the brethren, then they take that as a personal attack. Yeah. Whereas if they weren't so enmeshed, they'd be able to say, actually, there is some bad stuff that's happened or happening in the brethren, and they could sit and listen to that without getting all personally, emotionally threatened and taking it as a personal attack. So there's some quite complex dynamics going on, And I might give a little shout out for, I'm part of a podcast called Cult Chat here in New Zealand with two other people who are kind of active in this area of coercively controlling groups. And we've got a podcast called Organisations Under Threat, which, where we really discuss that whole dynamic of how organisations respond when they get threatened And often it is just through expose, through people just sharing, my gosh, this is what happened to me there. So yeah, recommendation to go and listen to us on there if you're interested in that, because it is a real psychological dynamic that plays out on a group scale when a group feels threatened and under attack, even if it's just simply for telling the truth, having the truth come out about them. So yeah, well done, Craig. It took a huge amount of courage to speak up as you have done, and it has come at a huge cost.
Yeah. And I'll attach a link below to that podcast in the description so that you guys can find it easy.
Awesome. I think I'll just carry on reading from the same place because this next bit is interesting.
It's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane. Talk about organizations responding under threat. Like, this is like a provoked children in the sandpit, just like veiling up and attacking somebody.
Filming outside the Brethren Sydney epicenter was a provocative move. I knew it would anger Bruce Hales and his heavies, although we had no idea how far they'd go to try to shut us down. What we did know was that this was one of the more serious threats they'd had in recent years in terms of public exposure, and they were probably holding crisis talks at the highest level as we stood there on the street in Ermington. One of the compound neighbours accosted us, insisting the Brethren were good people. He demanded that we leave and threatened violence if we did not comply. We were pretty much done by then, so to avoid escalating the situation, we packed up and left. I was in the passenger seat beside the sound recordist, Jeff, with Jackie in the back. Jackie's the reporter. We looped around the block and waited for a gap in traffic to turn back onto the main road. Jeff's phone rang as we idled at the intersection. It was Mitch, who had left in a separate vehicle. When Jeff hung up and said that we were being tailed and that Mitch was too, I thought it was a joke. Jackie leaned forward, telling us to lock our doors, and I laughed. Jeff's voice became urgent. No, seriously. I squinted into the side rear view mirror and did a double take. A black Mazda four-wheel drive was right behind us, but it was following us so closely that only its edge was visible. I was surprised they weren't scraping our bumper. Jeff stepped on the accelerator as we took off down Victoria Road, and I didn't dare check our speed. The black Mazda stayed hard on our tail, weaving in and out of traffic with bulldog tenacity. When it became obvious that we weren't going to shake our pursuers, Jeff slowed down. A service station appeared to the left, and on the spur of the moment, he pulled in under the bright lights. The black Mazda pulled in right behind us and waited in an alley that ran alongside the station. Jeff jumped out, ignoring Jackie's pleas to be careful, and ran towards them with his camera. The Mazda roared off down the alley, and Jeff laughed jubilantly as he got back in the car. Sweet with the success of having shaken them off, Jackie checked in with Mitch. He was faring much worse. Driving alone, he had 4 people on his tail in 2 vehicles. When he tried to do a U-turn, one of the pursuers veered across the road to block him. He and Jackie were discussing what to do when Jeff checked his mirrors. Oh shit, they're back. He hunkered down behind the wheel, and at one of the next intersections, he made a sudden left. The black Mazda flipped the same sharp turn and stayed bumper to bumper as we flew through deserted back streets. It was dark by then, and there was no one else in sight. At least there'd been witnesses on the main road. We were all panicking. Jackie feared there could be an accident, while Jeff was afraid we'd be run off the road or even killed. At that point, it didn't seem unthinkable that we could all end up dead and dumped in the harbour. We were relieved when the bright lights of Victoria Road reappeared. As we stopped for a red light, Jeff leaped out again to film our pursuer's vehicle and number plate. As he filmed through the windscreen, the brethren inside covered their faces with their hands so they couldn't be identified. Undeterred by the cameras, they continued their chase as we drove towards central Sydney. They were running red lights and cutting off traffic, doing whatever it took to stay on our tail. Channel 7 management, alerted to our predicament, put through an urgent request for police assistance. We were told we'd be safe at the city's central police station. Meanwhile, Channel 7 stepped in to save Mitch, the cameraman, as he managed to get to the main studio building and sought refuge in its secure underground car park, with brethren still in hot pursuit. A guard had to get between the vehicles, then the security gates came down behind Mitch. He'd finally escaped. Across town, we still had the brethren hard on our tail. They'd been chasing us for more than 20 kilometres, often at a distance of less than a metre. I wondered what would happen if we needed to brake suddenly. As we approached the police station at speed, we were thrown around when we bumped over judder bars literally flying through the air. It was like being in a movie, one of those surreal moments where everything moves in slow motion. At the station, we ran for safety and were met with raised eyebrows as we burst into the lobby. Jackie explained we were from Channel 7, we were being chased, and Sergeant Greg Cooper was expecting us. People stared in surprise when we were ushered through to the back offices. A short time later, a team of plainclothes officers fanned onto the Sydney streets to track down our pursuers. I was surprised to see they were armed. One lifted his shirt and the handle of a firearm poked from its hidden holster. Sergeant Cooper listened intently as we told our story. Two female investigators joined us, and I was asked detailed questions about my experiences with the Exclusive Brethren. One of the women told me that allegations of Dr. Craddock's malpractice would need to be investigated by a medical board. Half an hour later, the police told us that one of our pursuers had been arrested. At least one other had made off on foot. He was still at large when Jackie needed to catch her return flight to Melbourne, so she was taken to the airport in a patrol car. Officers escorted her through the terminal and onto the aircraft. They believed we might still be in danger and didn't want to take any chances. Jackie just wanted to get out of Sydney as quickly as possible. There was no guessing what the Brethren might try next. People often ask me what I think the Brethren were hoping to achieve here, and I still really don't know. It was such a bizarre experience. But I think it was typical of how the Brethren interacted in attempting to intimidate people with no real thought about what the end game was. All they cared about was that they were mad, as I see it looking back, and they wanted to do something that similarly threw us off balance.
Yeah, it's a very primal reactive place that I think fits in with some of the Brethren kind of, there is that sort of subculture of machoism of like, yeah, you know, I'm the man, I'm like big and bold and tough, and I'm gonna like, yeah, swing the first punch or pretend to, you know, come at me kind of thing. Yeah, that intimidation thing. It in some weird way it also reminds me of, in some ways, the animal cruelty, you know, subculture that is so often there. Like just recently in the news in New Zealand, there were a bunch of young Brethren guys charged with like ramming their cars into deer and killing and maiming animals. And you know, there was that bizarre news article of that man at a Australian petting zoo who just like grabbed a pet chicken and threw it to an alligator. And like in some ways it reminds me of that similar thing. There's like a profound arrogance and disrespect for anything deemed as other or like weaker, or just like, you know, Craig, you and journalists, the Brethren in there have got a narrative about journalists. They say that the Antichrist is going to be a journalist. They I can remember hearing Andrew Simmons, a priest in Auckland when I worked for him, make a comment over the political stuff. So, you know, there were some journalists at the door, and he turned away and he just said, they're just the scum of the earth. And like there's this whole, you know, so they would view you and journalists as being absolute scum, worth less than a chicken at a petting zoo. And so they think, oh, it's no problem for me to like intimidate, hunt you down, ram into you. I'm sure they would have quite happily done some of those things to like, because they just don't care and they sort of feel like it's their right. And it's fascinating that the police took it seriously and didn't let them get away with it. And, you know, later on you go to describe one of the guys being actually taken to court and charged with intimidation, even though they hired you know, a QC to defend him, and all that kind of thing, which again is classic Brethren behavior, like, oh, we're going to lawyer up with the top QC or KCs. Yeah, so they would have found that quite shocking and quite embarrassing actually, to have to submit to the law of the land there, because they would have thought they could get away with it.
And I think a lot of their behavior, like, it comes from this protect the testimony. So the foundation of it is protect the testimony. We've got to protect the testimony at all costs. And I mean, that comes right from the top. And then it funnels down. Again, like you say, it's that arrogance, but they're so disillusioned by breaking the laws. They're so avidly trying to protect the testimony that they're protecting the testimony often gets them into the trouble.
And just picking up on the holding them accountable thing, there's just a paragraph here that I'll read. I had another win when Dr. Mark Craddock was banned from practicing as a GP. Following the advice of the police investigators, I'd laid a complaint with the New South Wales Healthcare Complaints Commission, and a Professional Standards Committee inquiry had found him guilty of unsatisfactory professional misconduct. The committee drew attention to Craddock's failings in relation to basic patient examination and care, his irregular prescribing practice, and boundary violation. He was severely reprimanded, and the resulting GP ban meant he would no longer be able to prescribe drugs to fellow brethren. This would stop him from doing to anyone else what he'd done to me. And it was a significant blow for the brethren. Craddock was their last remaining medical doctor in New South Wales. And I include that point just to make the point that I wasn't the one who I laid a complaint about Dr. Craddock, but ultimately it was the authorities who were concerned enough about what was going on that they chased it through. And I wasn't, I didn't tell the police to prosecute over the car chase and so on. Like, in all these cases, it was the authorities, the people responsible for upholding the law, who were concerned enough about the way the brethren were behaving that they stepped in and launched investigations. And there's I know that in the brethren, I'm blamed for taking down Dr. Craddock or for attacking the position. So it's like, it wasn't me. This was my official government bodies who took this action. And if you are acting in a way or carrying out behaviours that are concerning enough that police are investigating and charging you, then maybe the issue is with your behaviour, not with the ex-brethren who are speaking out to draw attention to it.
And would you have reported that had you not been chased, ended up at a police station? And I mean, you had to tell your story. Would you back then reported it? Or would you have just let it be?
I don't even know. Like, when I left, I knew that what had happened to me was wrong.
Yeah.
But the more I stuck my head above the parapet, the stronger the backlash from the brethren became. And in a way, the harder they push back and the harder they try and sort of hit you around the head to shut you up, sort of the more it proves the point that they're not what they say they are.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can put in the footage, but it was just the dumbest thing to do, to chase cars full of TV reporters, because the first thing they're going to do is turn the cameras around and film it, which they did.
So here's the footage of what Craig is talking about.
Now, 6 months ago, we ran a story showing you how far a so-called church will go to stop ex-members publicly criticising it. The Exclusive Brethren is a secretive sect on the far right of the religious spectrum. And to stop our last report, it resorted to intimidation, stalking, even a car chase. But even the Brethren have to answer to the law. Here's Jackie Quist with the story they didn't want told.
Religious zealots turned predators, and we were their prey. Payback Brethren style. 6 brethren, 3 cars, a 15-kilometre chase. These two dogging and intimidating us in a joint criminal enterprise involving some dangerous driving. Our cameraman Mitch in his black 4-wheel drive, alone and tailed by 4 brethren in 2 cars, at times just centimetres off his bumper bar. After a half-hour pursuit, Mitch taking refuge in our Channel 7 underground car park.
It's an extraordinary thing that they would issue forth from their headquarters with 3 cars to harass somebody who's purely seeking to throw some light on their operations.
Author and Sunday Age journalist Michael Batchelard, a Brethren expert.
A law-abiding organisation doesn't criminally stalk somebody.
We now know the identity of one Brethren pursuer. He is Lionel Stephen Laming, and he and his accomplice chased us up to the City Central Police Station, where Sergeants Paul Hanna and Greg Cooper came to our rescue. The officers arresting Laming in the passenger seat of his car, close to the police station. The driver had fled. 6 months later, the day of reckoning. Laming's un-Christian-like behaviour brought to justice. In the Downing Centre local court, Laming was found guilty of intimidating us, convicted and placed on a 12-month good behaviour bond. He pleaded guilty to failing to disclose the driver's identity, again convicted, but with no further penalty. A miserable result for Laming, despite the efforts of his $12,000 a day barrister, Winston Terracini.
Please don't try to intimidate me with that camera.
What would the Brethren hierarchy think of this conviction?
Oh, they'd be furious. They'd be devastated. They like to avoid detection and avoid public humiliation, and that's what this is for them.
We believe this Christian fundamentalist sect took exception to us filming Excommunicated member Craig Hoyle outside their house of worship in Ermington, Sydney. No doubt incensed, we'd questioned Brethren Dr. Mark Craddock, who'd prescribed medication to Craig in a bizarre bid to treat his homosexuality. Do you prescribe this often for homosexuality?
No.
Why did you prescribe it in this instance? Homosexuality is not a disease.
He was wanting help. He was wanting to go a different way.
I think them dispatching the squad was absolutely in response to your questioning of Dr. Craddock. They would have realised how bad that was for them. They would have been angry and they would have been seeking revenge.
Incredibly, though, in a statement, the Brethren said Lionel Laming intends to appeal and that the Brethren doesn't condone illegal behaviour, but rather it preaches respect for and adherence to the law. Little wonder New South Wales Lisarow Valley residents like Kay Watts objected to the Brethren snapping up tracts of land in their neighbourhood.
It's gone to now an 800-person meeting hall. It's a gigantic building about the size of an aeroplane hangar.
Across the country, halls, mega churches and schools are popping up. In Canberra, South Australia, across Tasmania. Gaining momentum in Queensland, a force in Western Australia. In Victoria, Brethren families in at least 26 locations across the state. Its biggest numbers by far in New South Wales.
It's important that we have the clear light of public scrutiny showing what's going on.
Cult expert David Milliken telling us Exclusive Brethren is gaining strength in numbers, property and finance.
They are accumulating more funds. There's a lot more money amongst the Brethren than what there was in the past.
That's no deterrent. We'll continue to expose the truth behind the barbed wire, the formidable walls.
The damage that they do to their members, the control that they have over their lives, and the intimidation and reckless disregard for the psychological health of their members and people who've left needs to be scrutinised, needs to be brought out in the open.
Moving on, chapter 14 drops us back in time a bit. So after I left, I started connecting with a lot of the other Hoyles on the outside. And so chapter 14 starts telling some of those stories and introducing people like my great uncles and aunts and various cousins and so on. And we'll just go from the start and then pick out some different bits. On a warm Monday evening in the late 1970s, Benji and Wilson crept up the driveway and round the back of a small cottage in rural Waikato. The brothers, who had just come from a prayer meeting in nearby Cambridge, were on a Brethren spying mission. They were convinced that Gladys Cassane, the resident of the cottage, was having an affair with Hubert Hoyle. Hubert had been excommunicated several years earlier, but his wife, Jocelyn, had stayed with the Exclusive Brethren, and the sect was convinced of his suspected infidelity. Gladys's dark brown cottage sat nestled beneath a thick shelter belt of trees behind a white picket fence. Benji and Wilson, who had been dropped off some distance up the road to avoid detection, slunk through the bushes to her yard. They were careful not to make any noise as they crept across to her bedroom window. Hubert's car was parked in the driveway. The two brethren believed if they could just get a glimpse through the window, then they were sure to find Gladys and Hubert in a compromising position. The curtains were drawn, but there was a thin gap above the fabric. Benji and Wilson surreptitiously dragged over the nearby cellar door, loose from its hinges, and positioned it beneath the window. Certain that Hubert's adultery was about to be exposed, the brothers prepared to ascend for their righteous voyeurism. At that moment, a voice interjected behind them. "Can I help you?" Startled, they turned around to be confronted by Hubert's son, Wayne, himself freshly excommunicated in his early 20s. two more young men materialized from the trees and stopped the brethren peeping toms from making a run for it. And to me, this illustrates how the brethren feel they have sort of an ownership or an entitlement over people even after they have left.
Yes.
And as
Yes.
it happens, my uncle Hubert wasn't at that point sleeping with his neighbour Gladys, although he did actually later go on to marry her. But they knew that the brethren were spying on them, and they were like, well, if we lay a trap for them, they are surely going to fall into it. And so they'd set it up so that they left his car parked in her driveway, and then he just walked home. But they just wanted to leave it there so the brethren would think he was there. And I mean, the brethren priest fell right into it and came along to spy. And like the very idea that it's okay to try and look through someone's window to catch them having sex so that you can justify it, like it's just like the arrogance of it and the entitlement of it, and also just the creepiness of it. But they genuinely believed they were doing God's work, and so here they were having a peep through Gladys's window.
My gosh, that's fascinating, Craig. And you're right, there are so many accounts of this kind of spying, and you're right, it goes hand in hand with a belief that that's absolutely fine, that's not a violation of respect or personal privacy or boundaries, which comes back again, in my view, to the enmeshment thing, that because brethren have got such a peculiar way of viewing their community, and it is so enmeshed that it's kind of like, well, what someone in our community does, or even a former member, it is my business, darn it, and I have every right to know, even if that means spying or listening at doors or whatever. And it's, now they've got more professional and more happy to pay for these sorts of services. We also know there's countless examples where former members allege being, or have been proved to have, private investigators hired to follow them. And I know I've spoken about that, I think, on this podcast, because a investigative journalist here in New Zealand, Nikki Hager, he did have private investigators who were employed by the brethren speak to him about that, a whistleblower saying, and that I was apparently one of the ones they had private investigators looking at. And at that stage, this was like a couple of years before Olive Leaf was born, I literally wasn't doing anything activistic against the brethren, and I found it so peculiar, and I did find it a huge violation of my privacy. And it is really distressing, like I was at home every day with a young baby, and we live near a reserve where, if you wanted to get binoculars and spy on my house, you could. And I used to feel quite intimidated sometimes, just being like, I have no idea where I'm being watched or followed. It is very intimidating. It's a horrible, horrible experience to think that you've got private investigators on you. And I'm sure that Hubert, in your story, and others must have felt similar. You do feel really, your privacy is being violated, and it is really disrespectful. And especially if you're excommunicated, they've got no reason to know what is going on in your life, and it's really strange.
And just like a bit of context there, Hubert had been withdrawn from and lost his wife and 6 kids, because he had been building a new grain store, and he'd started construction before he'd gone into town to get the proper paperwork. And the local building inspector raised it with the priest in Cambridge, who withdrew from him.
Stop it. I have just found out that my grandpa, that's one of the reasons he was withdrawn from, Peter Wynne. I didn't realise this because there's been some controversy around, he was booted out 3 times, but I just found out that is the last reason why he was withdrawn from, was the exact thing. He began construction work when the paperwork was still at the council office, and there were particular reasons why he had to around the time that he'd booked off work. And I couldn't believe it, that, a wife lost her husband, 6 children lost their father, because somebody began construction work. In his case, it was like for a sun porch
Mm.
without, when the paperwork was a couple of weeks away. Like, are you kidding me?
Wow.
Mm. Yes, Hubert was working as a farming contractor, and it was his construction of a grain store that ran him afoul of the local Cambridge leaders. Hubert, pressed for time, had started digging the foundations before driving 20 minutes to nearby Hamilton to seek the necessary permits, a move that raised the ire of the local building inspector when he happened to drive past. Hubert was rapped over the knuckles, and a stop order was put on construction. This news quickly made its way to the local Brethren leaders, who convened an assembly meeting to address Hubert's sins. He was astonished when the priests told him he was being withdrawn from. You broke the law, therefore you're a lawless man, and we don't have fellowship with lawless people.
Oh,
Um,
that's terrible.
But what a way to lose everything.
It is horrific. And again, you're like, this is not just this man's life. This is a marriage. This is children losing their father. This is parents losing their son. Like, these things are atrocious. There are so many atrocious accounts of what the Brethren have done to families. It's not what God's done to the families.
Yeah.
It's not even what the mysterious devil has done. This is what Brethren leaders have done to families. Like Jesus said, and is it Matthew somewhere, he says, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, they have tied heavy burdens on the backs of people, and they have not lifted one finger to help them.
Wow.
This stuff is on the hands of the Brethren leadership. It's atrocious.
Mm.
Could you imagine what the PBCC would be like now if they withdrew everybody who was being lawless?
You mean referring to technical, not following technical?
No, I'm just talking everything that they do. Yeah, everything that they do.
Like, for example, driving over the limit. That's technically illegal, and yet we know it happens.
Yeah, just all of it. The things that we hear from people who work for them, and some of the things that go on behind the scenes that land on our lap just blows your mind that they think that they're this entitled.
Like being tax efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Are
right?
you talking about that kind of thing with finances?
Yeah. And what they ask workers to do for them to avoid certain things. Yeah, there's a reason why they're being investigated by the ATO. That's not just a one-off chance thing.
I remember a local Brethren owner in Invercargill who lost his license because he'd had too many speeding tickets. And he couldn't, like, the local police knew what his car was and his registration, so he couldn't be seen driving around his car. And so he was asking his non-Brethren employee if he could take their car so that he could drive around town without a license because police wouldn't recognize the non-Brethren car. So,
oh my God.
So we'll pick up on the book back where I met Hubert, probably about more than 30 years after he'd been withdrawn from, when I was withdrawn from myself. And this was part of that process of tracking down family on the outside and meeting them for the first time. Hubert stood out from the crowd when I met him for the first time at Melbourne's Flinders Street railway station in 2009, the year I left the Brethren myself. He had a full head of snowy white hair, so striking that his family and friends called him Snow. We'd never seen each other before, but there was no mistaking the family likeness, and Uncle Snow beamed as he stepped forward to shake my hand. You must be a Hoyle. Conversation came easily as we caught the tram to the suburb of Camberwell, where his younger sister Dorothy lived. Snow and Dorothy were my grandfather's siblings, but until my recent excommunication, I'd only been vaguely aware of their existence. They were both, in the Brethren telling of things, bad people. Snow had abandoned his family when he was excommunicated, we were told, while Dorothy had brought deep sorrow to my great-grandparents when she ran away as a wayward teen. I quickly discovered the truth was rather different. Dorothy and Snow's stories of their upbringing in the 1940s and 1950s sounded familiar. Dancing was forbidden, school sports were banned, and the Hoyle children weren't even allowed to take library books home. Dorothy kept a stash of secret books in a tin at the bus stop, 3 miles from the family home. If a book was particularly good, she'd sneak it home and read it with a torch under the bed covers, hoping she wouldn't be discovered by her religious mother. Dorothy, freckled with whitish blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, knew she faced a life of drudgery if she stayed in the exclusive Brethren. Forced to leave school at a young age, she would be consigned to help her mother with the housework until she was married off to be a dutiful wife, an agonizing prospect for a girl who regularly came top of the class. Dorothy carefully planned her escape as a teenager, just as I would 2 generations later. She saved up £14, took a few things from home, gave notice at her job, cycled into town one Friday morning for work, then packed her bag and bike onto a bus, leaving Cambridge that evening. When the bus got to Hamilton, she sent a short telegram to her parents. I'd left home. They were distraught. Later, when Dorothy was tracked down at a hostel in Auckland, police officers were sent to check on her well-being. The Brethren seemed to expect the officers would escort the wayward teen back home to Cambridge. Instead, she was told she was free to set her own path. Although she had fled the family home, Dorothy wasn't quite ready to abandon the church of her upbringing. She started attending services in Auckland, putting on a nominal show of being a good Brethren woman. The harsh doctrine of separation was yet to be introduced, and in 1957 it was still tolerated, although frowned upon, for a young woman to strike out on her own. Behind closed doors, though, Dorothy took an irreverent view of Brethren doctrine. She was soon flatting in the central suburb of Parnell with Marion Bacon, another young Brethren woman who went on to marry Harland Mason, for those in New Zealand who know the Mason family. And the pair took great delight in seeing how many transgressions could be committed simultaneously. You could swear, put your feet on furniture, not go to church, wear lipstick, about 20 or 30 things at once. When Dorothy had fled the small Waikato town, she wasn't only escaping her family and their restrictive church, she was also escaping abuse. Dorothy's voice fills with disgust when she remembers Roy Brewer, the Brethren man who sexually abused her friend's dad. It started during a beach trip to the coastal town of Thames, where she found herself sunbathing on the beach beside Roy, a respected elder in his mid-40s, whose wife lay to his right. I'm lying on my tummy and he slides his hand under my breast. I didn't do anything, didn't move, didn't say anything, just froze. It was the beginning of a months-long pattern of sexual abuse. Roy would tickle Dorothy in the pool, fondle her with his feet under the table at family meals, he was fairly practiced, and watch for her on the streets of Cambridge. To add insult to injury, her abuser was one of the elders sent to Auckland to appeal for her return. Roy Brewer, probably terrified out of his head, thinking that it might be something to do with him, showed up with his wife to tell Dorothy she was missed by their daughter and tried to talk me into going back. Dorothy intended to take Roy's secret to her grave. A year after she made her escape, Dorothy unexpectedly found herself back in Cambridge. Driving from Whangarei, she had been involved in a car crash and had a minor head wound, and authorities sent the teen to stay with her parents while she recovered from her injuries. Her highly religious mother, Rhoda, sat on the bed as she lay in the spare room, looking concerned and touching her injured head, before launching into a very personal line of questioning about whether she'd been involved in improper behaviour. Rhoda's questioning was so oblique that Dorothy assumed she must be referring to what had happened with Roy Brewer. Nothing was asked about the details, just indirect questions about whether Dorothy had acted improperly. Vulnerable and ashamed, she proffered a simple confession: yes. Upon Dorothy's return to Auckland, she was invited to dinner at the home of Cyril Bennett, Roy's brother-in-law. Cyril cornered her after the meal and led her into his office, where she was ordered to name her sin and depart from it. Dorothy didn't know what on earth Cyril was talking about, so he helped her out. It's adultery. Baffled and not having any idea what adultery meant, Dorothy went along with his suggestion. Okay. Her matters were soon addressed at an assembly meeting in Cambridge, where members packed in to hear about her sins. Dorothy, sitting in the back rows with her mother and sisters, clung to a young niece as though the toddler could shield her from judgmental stares. It was surreal. She had become a branded person, withdrawn from and completely humiliated, and still had no idea what the accusation even meant. Dorothy's family refused to talk to her after she was excommunicated, and she was abandoned to live her supposedly wicked life. Nobody ever questioned her about what exactly had happened. As she left the Brethren Hall that day, condemned for adultery, she had still never had sex. The only sexual acts she'd been involved in were done to her without her consent by one of the elders sitting at the front of the congregation. He went scot-free, while the teen girl he'd abused was sent packing in shame.
Oh, horrific.
Um,
Horrific.
Such an
And this
important
is-
story to be told in here.
And I'm very, very grateful to my Auntie Dorothy. who's still alive and who was very supportive of the book project, for being so open and sharing some of these stories. And it's a really confronting process when you're interviewing family members, because you would never normally be approaching your 80-something-year-old great aunt and saying, like, tell me about these really messed up things that happened to you when you were younger. And normally when people start to get uncomfortable with these stories, the polite thing to do is pull back. And as a journalist or as a researcher, the really awkward thing is that when you hit those moments of trauma or tension, you have to keep going into them. And so to have people like Dorothy who were happy to be interviewed and happy to be grilled isn't quite the right word, because they consented to it. And I would always say at the beginning, if you're uncomfortable with where this is going, we can stop at any time. And if there's anything that we talk about that you don't want to include, we will leave it out. And so just to make that clear for people that are listening to this, that Dorothy was fully consenting to this process. She agreed to be interviewed about this. She agreed to these questions. And then she also read through the section about her and approved everything before it was published. And so people, even through these really traumatic parts of the book, and as far as it is possible, have been a part of the process of telling their own stories. And to me, Dorothy's story is really important to include, because it shows how long some of these things have been going on for. And I know after I left that I was shocked at the number of people who had stories of being abused in one way or another. And it was never talked about. We never talked about it in the Brethren. Occasionally people would get shut up or withdrawn from, but you didn't always know for what, or the way it was described was so vague that you could sort of draw any conclusion that you wanted. And I think in the Brethren there is this obsession with anything to do with sex, or anything that involved any expression of sexuality. And to me, that focus is completely wrong. Like, there was never any talk of consent and what that meant and how it was okay to say no. And there were these massive power imbalances, like we've talked on this podcast before. Like, we had a great uncle who everybody knew was handsy with your sisters. And my sisters were never told, no, actually, you don't have to have physical contact with Uncle Dave. Like, it was just something that everybody had to tolerate. And these power imbalances, I think, meant that a lot of people got abused, my Auntie Dorothy among them. And then the victims were blamed for what had happened.
Yeah, that's right, Craig. Yeah, that's right. I totally support what you've said, and have heard so many accounts of that where, there's so many people who have left who have got abuse in their stories, and whether that oftentimes that abuse is directly what contributed to them leaving, because their situation at home or whatever was so intolerable. But time and time again, the story they tell of if they did ever try and speak up or seek help, they would be told, things like, oh, God can wash you from your sin, i.e. you're the dirty one now, and God needs to wash you from your sin. But as to the perpetrator or the abuser, leave often a him in our hands, and, God will cover that. And never, and sort of a naive belief on the behalf of the victim that the priests were going to, go to the authorities, or we're going to stop that person, or we're going to hold them accountable. But it seems that time and time again, that never happened. As we know, that abusers were allowed to remain in fellowship, continued to have access to children or family members, and who they were, not safe to be around. There's so many accounts of that it's not just a one-off sad story. And same with the language around like adultery or fornication. I've got a relative who, as a young woman was excommunicated for fornication, but actually what happened to her was rape. It wasn't a consensual act of sex. It was actually rape, and yet she was told, this is fornication, you have fornicated. you're off. And it was, the whole assembly was told it was fornication. And so I just wonder how many times that sort of thing has happened as well.
And that's what it's, when you're reading this, and when I read it for the first time, I was so happy to see something like this, because you now are changing the narrative of the history that those that are still in there are being told and still being told, right? Because that's what happens. I was talking to somebody recently who had completely was going along with a narrative that was being told inside there. And I'm like, you know what? They play this same narrative on so many things. Oh, they left for another person. Oh, they had this. They have the same narratives that get put down. Dorothy here, literally now, people can sit down and read this and realize, oh, really? That's what went on? We were told this. And you guaranteed what they were told was not actually what happened. And again, here's what we started our podcast saying with what was Craig saying. It's so important for voices to come forward, because in this case, Craig, by you coming forward, it allowed some history to unravel. And then those that are inside the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church still get to see the actual truth of a situation.
And just to make the point as well, that in all of these stories that are described in the book, they have not just come from the person whose story it is, or the person or the people who are immediately involved. Like in this case, for instance, with Dorothy, where we're talking about how she was withdrawn from. For me, it was a case of going back and cross-checking that against letters that were written at the time and finding other people who were at the meeting when she was withdrawn from, and going to them, you know, not part of the family at all. And some of them are in their 90s now, but going to them and saying, what do you remember of this? And stepping through everything that happened and making sure that people's versions of events are corroborated and making sure that they are true. And it's really important to me to just make that point that everything in the book, when it comes to some of those factual details, has been cross-referenced and checked to make sure that it is accurate. And you know, the criticism from the Brethren, and I know from my parents, has been that I'm attacking the position, and that is too vague as a criticism. If people have a problem with things that they think are factually inaccurate or things that they think are unfair, then they're welcome to reach out. I'm not hard to contact. And if there is something that is wrong, then I'm happy to have a conversation about that and acknowledge that it's wrong. But to me, just saying you're attacking the position, that's a cop-out. That's too vague. You just don't like the fact that this is out there, which is not a valid criticism. Sorry. Moving through some of these stories, they're just little vignettes about what had happened to some of the Hoyles. Dorothy and Snow's uncle Norman had been withdrawn from in his late 60s for refusing to drink alcohol. A gentle farmer who worked as a security guard at the bank in semi-retirement, Norman Hoyle had witnessed the havoc of alcoholism. It had torn apart his grandparents' marriage. When he was a young boy, his grandfather, John Burgess, my great-great-great-grandfather, lived away from the family home in a small shack where he could drink to his heart's content. Norman would be sent to deliver meals to his booze-ridden grandfather, a task that left a lasting impression. For the rest of Norman's life, he referred to alcohol as the devil's firewater. Norman kept his head down as the Brethren started drinking heavily through the 1960s and into the 1970s. He loved his wife of more than 35 years and didn't want to rock the boat. As drinking alcohol went from being encouraged to being enforced, however, abstinence became evidence that you didn't fully agree with the church's teachings and must be suffering from some moral defect. Determined to flush out Norman's allegiances and under pressure from the priests, his wife Josie placed an alcoholic drink beside his dinner one evening in the 1970s. Norman recoiled. "Take it away." Dismayed, Josie reported to the elders that her husband would not drink alcohol, and Norman was promptly excommunicated. More than 3 decades of happy marriage weren't enough to keep Josie by her husband's side. One day while he was out, she packed up her things and disappeared. Nearly 70 years of loyal Brethren life counted for nothing. He'd been kicked out like so many others, all because he refused to drink whiskey. Norman had recurring nightmares about his excommunication. In one vivid dream, his judgment day at the Peach Grove Road meeting room ended with the priests proclaiming he must die before the firing squad. He watched helplessly as his first cousin retrieved rifles from the hall and handed them out to other elders. When Norman woke, very much alive, he reflected that the brethren had indeed passed judgment and ripped away the only life he knew. A few years after Norman was excommunicated, his sister Gwen Hoyle, who never married, was working in a doctor's surgery in Auckland. At the nightly church services, she would often regale other brethren women with stories of patients the doctor had seen that day. One evening after church in 1979, Gwen described a particularly difficult patient to her cousin June Scarlett and jokingly added an aside, "If it had been up to me, I would have prescribed arsenic." Gwen should have known better than to make such a flippant joke to June, whose husband was Don Scarlett, one of the New Zealand leaders who would later thunder at the Wellington congregation about the sins of my grandpa George. It never occurred to Gwen that she might be out of line until to her shock she discovered that June had reported her comment to Don. It was even more of a shock to be told that the brethren were excommunicating her for having murderous thoughts. With no warning, she found herself on the outside at the age of 70. When I was a child, her story was often repeated as a cautionary tale. Sometimes when my siblings and I made petty remarks along the lines of, "I wish you were dead," a warning would come from older brethren. Remember what happened to Gwen Hoyle. The Auckland brethren assumed Gwen would be another case who came crawling back for forgiveness. After a few weeks of isolation, during which every brethren member refused to talk to her, the elders visited her home in the southern suburb of Papatoetoe to see if she had repented. They knocked at the door, then knocked again. Nobody answered. Gwen was gone. For years, she had sat at the back of Brethren services in Auckland, remaining silent, as was expected of all women, daydreaming as she saw member after member excommunicated for their sins. If they ever do that to me, she thought, I think I'll go to Norfolk Island. A remote subtropical outpost between Australia and New Zealand, the island was the kind of holiday destination that was forbidden for Brethren. Gwen had never been on an aeroplane before, but that wasn't going to stop her. When the elders knocked on her door that evening, she was already on Norfolk Island. For Gwen, going back to the exclusive brethren was out of the question, even though it was the only life she had known for 70 years. She forged ahead and reconnected with the other excommunicated Hoyles. Her exclusive brothers cut her off, but she reunited with Norman, writing to him about how overjoyed she was with her freedom. Like the good old days, I'm so pleased. She also reconnected with her niece Dorothy, and they travelled the world together, taking a mountain train up the Jungfraujoch in Switzerland, visiting the former home of Anne Frank in Amsterdam, and road tripping across the English countryside, always with a trusty thermos for Gwen's 15 cups of tea a day. I met Auntie Gwen for the first time at her 100th birthday party just a few weeks after my excommunication. She had spent 30 years as the matriarch aunt of the excommunicated Hoyles, loved by her brother's children, their grandchildren, and then their great-grandchildren, and had enjoyed life to the full. Her story is proof that no matter how old you are, it's never too late to escape and start again.
Such a beautiful story.
Yes.
Going back to the comment about arsenic, and I think it was last podcast we were talking about how at the review, right? People were all, the review was happening with things that were done. Here's another example though, too, right? Where now, we had the arsenic being written right into ministry, and the leader was, and here is someone being kicked out way back when for even jokingly talking about it.
Yeah, that is so ironic, Cheryl.
Good old Auntie Gwen, she just really wasn't going to have a bar of their bullshit. And amazing as well to get to 70 and then be like, no, bugger it. Like this is too much. And she lived past 100, so she still had a good 30 years on the outside.
Imagine what she must have just lived. Like she must have just lived it up and soaked in every moment.
All this travel that she did. Going on her big adventure to Europe and traveling around England and being able to connect with, because of course she'd lived pre-separation, and being able to reconnect with cousins who were never in the brethren, to go back and have those connections again. And so the sort of the freedom and the escape for someone like Gwen of getting out even at 70. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the older you get, the more difficult it can be to leave. But I look at people now in their 50s and 60s saying, oh, well, I've left it too late. And I was like, I don't think it's ever too late.
No. Even 3 months on the outside fills your cup up. You could be 85 years old and leave and make every moment count.
Exactly. And so we'll just pick up. So Uncle Snow, the chapter ends describing how they caught the priests at Gladys Cassane's house. Snow claps his hands together as he describes how Benji and Wilson took the bait. The brothers, caught in the act, tried to bluster their way through. We're here to see Mrs. Cassane. But there was no explanation for why they were trying to see Mrs. Cassane through her bedroom window. The brothers were marched to the front door and told if they wanted to see Gladys, they should knock and do it properly. When Gladys, in on the plan, emerged in her dressing gown, she stared at the two peeping Toms and said, I don't know them. She decided not to press charges, but it was the final nail in the coffin for Snow. For 3 years, he'd held out hope that he might find a path back to his brethren, wife, and children. I tried to get back in for so long. Now he gave up hope and filed for divorce. More than 25 years after his excommunication, during the infamous review, the brethren contacted him and apologized for how he had been treated. The elders laid an offer on the table. You can come back and marry Jocelyn. It was an enticing, it was an enticing thought, and Snow had a simple message for his ex-wife. I would love to marry you again. But for Snow, the offer of a second chance at marriage to his first love came decades too late. He had built a life for himself outside the sect and was blunt when his brother Lewis got in touch for the first time in many years. I couldn't come back to a system that breaks up families. Lewis trotted out a familiar retort. The brethren don't break up families, it's the devil. Although now we've heard that that doctrine has changed. Snow was so disgusted he didn't reply. For a few years, though, he took advantage of the loosened rules to re-establish contact with his 4 brethren adult children. They welcomed him into their homes, but he found it difficult to have any sort of conversation with them. About the only thing they'd say was, Dad, would you like a cup of tea? He'd reply, yes, thank you, and get his cup of tea, but nobody else would have one. He would sit, awkwardly sipping, while his estranged children watched on in silence. After decades of no contact, he didn't feel a connection to them. They were strangers, really. Snow, by then living in Melbourne, decided to cease contacting his brethren children. He paid a special visit back to New Zealand to tell them so in person, explaining to each of them, married with grown-up kids of their own, that he felt they were being disrespectful and leading him on with their arm's-length contact. I'm only encouraging you to do what I consider wrong by calling and seeing you. His children seemed shocked and they cried. There was one important caveat to Snow's announcement. He was happy to see his children at any time, he told them, but they had to take the initiative and make first contact. He was done with constantly trying to build bridges. My door is wide open. My love for each of you is unconditional. You can contact me if ever you want to. Then Snow went on with his life. None of his brethren children made an effort to stay in touch. They were happy, it seemed, to drift back to being strangers, despite their tearful remonstrations. Uncle Snow's experiences resonate with me, just as Grandpa George's do. It's exactly the same, but different, Snow tells me, reflecting on our shared trauma. The pain, he says, never goes away. Even as happier memories are layered on top, you've always got it there. You can't get away from that. Snow shakes his head. Look, it's absolutely crazy. You're one of the few persons that I could talk to about this sort of stuff and not just shake your head and say, goodness, you must be making this up, Snow. He prefers not to dwell on the pain of the past, instead being quietly supportive of others who have been through terrible things. Do you have any regrets? I ask him. No, not from my side. I wish the brethren hadn't lost my family for me, but I would never have met you like this if they hadn't done that. And there's a lot of other beautiful people that I would never have met. My glass is always half full. Uncle Snow has died now, but I was very, very pleased that I had, at that point I didn't have any idea that I might be writing a book. But at one point when I visited Melbourne, I just sat down and got him to describe his life story and how he felt about it, and very, very pleased that I did that now. And to get the perspective of people like Snow, who had been through these awful experiences, losing his wife and his 6 kids over something as petty as not having a building permit for his new grain store. And he was never angry about it. And he was the kindest, sort of most gentle guy that you could meet. And despite that, though, he also had a really firm sense of what was right and what was wrong. And that the half-assed contact that some brethren keep up with their family on the outside, which, as Snow called out, can be really disrespectful. When people on the inside are leading you on, and they'll have a little bit of contact, and then they won't, and then they will, and then they won't. And I think Snow quite rightly called that out as being disrespectful, and I think abusive, because you're constantly keeping people on the hook, and they don't know what to expect. And we still hear this among outsiders now, is that they have a little bit of contact with their family on the inside, and so they don't want to speak out, and they don't want to rock the boat for fear of impacting that tiny little bit. And it's just, to me, it really makes me angry, because basically they're throwing the merest crumbs off the table and expecting you to go scrambling around and be grateful for them. And as soon as you do anything that they don't like, they'll stop throwing the crumbs. And Snow called that out.
I'm so glad that you brought that out and did an analogy like that, because that's literally what it is. You're getting just tiny little scrapes of crumbs off of, literally, after they've walked away from the table long ago, right? And some, their maid comes along and throws it on the floor. That's what you're getting. And because it feeds your emotional wounds a little bit, that's why they hold on. And I understand that. I completely understand that. But at the same time, I agree. It's time now. The time is now where we need to be brave and start talking about what needs to be exposed.
And this is not to say you shouldn't have that contact with people on the inside. And, we all talk to insiders who need support. But
Absolutely.
I think it's really important to make the point that that contact needs to be on your terms and something that works for you, not you just clinging on to whatever they're prepared to offer on their terms. That brings us to the end of chapter 14. Chapter 15 comes back to my story, and by this point I've been out of the Brethren for a while, a couple of years. So we'll go from the start. When I returned to Invercargill for a visit 2 years after my excommunication, Dad threatened to call the police on me. Wasn't like I wanted to be back in town. I'd rather have been anywhere else, in fact, but I still had bits and pieces stuck in storage, so I reluctantly hired a van to drive it all up to my new home in Auckland. I knew full well that my family didn't want to see me. Yet in some forlorn recess of my mind, I hoped they might have a change of heart. Dad was abrupt when I phoned to ask if I could see them. No. But I figured he couldn't do much if I just showed up on the doorstep. That Saturday afternoon, I regretted my decision almost immediately. Mum wasn't home, and Dad stood coldly at the front door, arms crossed, as he refused to let me come inside. Was this really where I used to live, and was this really the man who had raised me? My parents were clearly a lost cause, but maybe Grandma Edith would be more welcoming. Her final letters had been full of beseeching love, and I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that she might turn against me after our heartbreaking farewell. My throat tightened as I drove the short distance to her house. Everything looked just as I remembered: the newly mown lawn, the neatly trimmed hedge, the tidy white bungalow with pale blue trim. The curtains were drawn, but I could see her Toyota Corolla in the driveway. I took a moment to steel my nerves before knocking on the door. What was she going to say? There was no reply to my persistent taps, no twitching of curtains, nor signs of life. Yet I knew she must be there. Why wasn't she coming to the door? Even if she didn't want to see me, the least she could do was tell me so to my face. I hadn't been wondering for long when a diesel engine roared around the corner and Dad pulled up in his work truck. He was seething with righteous anger as he marched across Grandma Edith's front lawn, telling me, "Get off the property right now." I wasn't going anywhere, especially now that Dad was trying to order me around. Who did he think he was, still trying to wield that bullying Brethren authority? Had he forgotten that I no longer believed in his supposedly divine position as the head of the household? Determined not to let him win, I sat down on the front doorstep. I'm not going anywhere until I see Grandma. As Dad ranted at me from the front lawn, threatening to call the police, out the corner of my eye I saw the passenger door of his truck quietly open. Had he brought along priestly backup? 2 gangly legs emerged, then a white t-shirt and a freckled face surrounded by coppery ginger hair. It was my youngest sister, Bella. 2 years had passed since that evening when she'd offered to give me her savings if I agreed to stay, and I was surprised to see how much she'd grown. Dad didn't see her emerge. His view was obscured by the gardens and by the bushes in Grandma's front garden, and besides, he was too busy berating me for my wickedness. I was torn. I wanted to run to Bella, offer a warm hug, and tell her how much I loved her, but if Dad realized she was out of the truck, he'd quickly intervene. I couldn't give her away. While his tirade continued and I pretended to listen, Bella quietly closed the truck door and crept into position between 2 bushes, away from Dad's eyes, but in my direct line of sight. What was she trying to do? Was she just a curious 11-year-old wanting to know what all the fuss was about? She waved to make sure I was looking. I couldn't wave back without drawing Dad's attention, but we locked eyes for a moment and she mouthed, "I still love you." It took everything I had not to break down and cry. This was proof that at least one person in my immediate family still loved me. And how could I possibly have believed their feelings were completely gone? When Dad paused for a brief moment and looked away, wearing himself down with his religious anger, I flashed the briefest of smiles at Bella and mouthed back, "I love you too." That encounter with my little sister was the merest of olive branches, but it held me back from giving up on my family. I tried to keep in touch with Mum, occasionally sending letters to tell her I was okay. Letters were easier than phone calls. I didn't have to endure being hung up on. She never wrote back, but one day my baby book arrived in the mail, filled with her notes from the months after my birth. There was no letter or card, but wrapped around the book were the recipes for 12 of my favourite childhood dishes. My hot tears dripped onto the list of ingredients for chocolate silk pie. And this is the agonizing thing after coming out of the Brethren is that remember when we were in there, people used to make the argument when we would say that the Brethren were ripping up, tearing apart families. They would say, well, families fall out all the time in the real world as well. So what's the difference? And the difference here is that the separation is not by choice. It's not because people don't still love each other. And I think, you know, with people like my mum, if we genuinely didn't like each other, if we had genuinely gone our separate ways, then that would be a lot easier to make my peace with. But in situations like this, I know, you know, I knew that my mum still loved me, and I know that she still loves me now. And I don't doubt that she's still praying every day that I'll come back to the fellowship. It's incredibly difficult to move on from people who you still love and who you know still love you. And that is not at all the same thing as a breakdown in a family relationship, because in this case, the breakdown has been imposed on the family by the Brethren.
Yeah, it's someone telling them not to, right? Like out here in the real world, I mean, you can get into an argument with family members. You're in here, you're taking apart people who love each other and giving them indoctrinated orders to separate. Like it's just heart-wrenching. It's my heart breaks for Bella in this whole book, all of it, because we all have siblings in there that cling on to. How do you explain that in their brain? And all that their brain has to hold on to is that they're just a bad person, right? Like they don't want to be in meeting, or, you know, in my mom's world, it's like, oh, well, she disowned us. Well, it's not about that at all, right? Like I really, really feel for the younger siblings and what they had to go through as we walked out those doors. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just, this is no way to all the insiders listening to this, to the people who go through our podcasts that are ordered to watch them. You're ripping apart people who love each other. That does not happen out here. It only happens in high demand religious groups. It does not happen in the normal world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's horrific. Yeah.
Mm.
Often the people who are probably overlooked, sometimes the younger siblings, you know, as someone with younger siblings who I left, and I know it, it was a huge grief to me to leave them, especially when you know that you're leaving them in sometimes an environment that's not so good for them. And, I took seriously my role to be, the protective big sister and caregiver and nurturer and that kind of thing. And it went against every bone in my body to have to be cut off from them. It wasn't my choice at all to be separated from them. And I'm sure same for them for me. Yeah, you're right, Cheryl. It's something that's imposed on them, and they're often silent victims in the whole process, and it is incredibly traumatizing for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like as always, it's been talked about a lot, but we're cut off from our family on the inside, but then there's new family on the outside that really demonstrates how messed up the Brethren approach is. So I think if we just carry on reading the next section. As I'd made my first halting steps in the outside world, Sarah Hall, true to her word, had stepped in to replace the mother I'd lost. Sarah Hall was the reporter who had told my story for 60 Minutes. And during that process of filming, she'd actually gone round and knocked on my parents' front door to talk to my mum, not as part of the story, but because she wanted to talk to one mother to another. And she told mum that I was going to be okay and that she would help look after me on the outside, which was an astonishing thing for a senior reporter from 60 Minutes to go out on a limb like that. My first flat in Auckland was just around the corner from where she lived with her husband, Grant, and they took part in all the occasions when my parents were absent. Birthdays, Christmases, graduation. Knowing what was lost, they went out of their way to make sure I wasn't alone. Meeting Mum had made a deep impression on Sarah. She could see that what had happened to me was horrific, but felt that what had happened to my mother was too. Knowing she must wonder what had happened to me, Sarah wrote to her, one mother to another, to reassure her I would not be alone in life. Craig and I have become extremely close, Sarah explained, going on to tell Mum I was happy and content. I realise your religious beliefs prevent you from seeing Craig, so I want you to know that here, on the outside, he has a family. Our 3 children treat Craig as a brother, and my husband and I will continue to watch over him as he goes through life. He will spend Christmases and birthdays with us. He will not be alone. Please rest assured that Craig is loved, accepted, and supported, and surrounded by people who care for him. One evening at Sarah's house, a casual reference to Mr. Tambourine Man revealed that I didn't know who Bob Dylan was. Discovering the extent of my pop culture ignorance was astonishing for Sarah and then exciting. What do you mean you've never heard of Bob Dylan? We were tucked up on armchairs beside an open fire, and Sarah reached for a laptop. The opportunity to introduce someone to her favourite music was too good to pass up, and she lined up song after song after song. Many more evenings passed like that, hours of laughter as we listened our way through decades of back catalogues. We were far beyond anything I was used to from the Brethren, and it was remarkable to think that so many songs had passed me by. Sometimes the laughter faded away as we had a familiar song that triggered memories. Sarah hugged me and poured another glass of wine as I wept and talked about Mum and everything else I'd lost. We'd sit quietly for a while as the enormity of what had happened came sweeping back up. What do you say to someone who's lost everything? That it's going to be okay? Sarah knew better than to talk like that. Through it all, she remained indignant about how the Exclusive Brethren were treating young queer people. She and Grant offered their spare bedroom to several gay boys who left after me. One arrival was particularly dramatic. The Brethren had chased them from a neighbouring region, and church members skulked around outside the couple's home. After Grant confronted them on the street, they agreed to sit down at the kitchen table for a proper conversation. Grant and Sarah made it very clear where they stood. The boys are safe here and they'll be looked after, and you're not to threaten our family. Don't come round to our door and threaten us with your standover tactics. For Sarah, each gay boy she helped rescue from the Brethren was a personal victory, and she let us all know about it as she walked around the house. Sarah 3, Brethren 0. We laughed, but a serious message lay behind her celebrations. Those poor kids in the Brethren are being told that they're evil and that they're going to hell, when all they need is some love and affection and to be accepted for who they are. And this just gets back to the point of, when you're in there, you're told that the world is a cold, hard place and that the assembly is the only place you'll find love and acceptance and so on. And Sarah was a complete stranger who was a reporter at 60 Minutes, one of those evil journalists that we were talking about, who was so indignant about the way that the brethren were behaving, and so sort of moved by what had happened to me and also what my mother must be going through, that she stepped in to become that parent figure in my life. And it was really important to her to not just make sure that I was okay, but also to make sure that my mum knew that I was okay. And so right from the very beginning, there was that recognition of what had happened to my mum and how impossible and how heartbreaking it was for her to have lost one of her children, as we were just saying, not by choice. It was something that was imposed on her by the brethren, and she'd had to make a call. It was me or the other 6 children. And so I don't begrudge her for choosing the other 6 children, but that doesn't mean that the pain of losing me was any less for her.
Yeah, yeah. That was really beautiful of Sarah Hall to do that. And yeah, I, like you, I've also experienced incredible kindness from people who were strangers to me and who have no good reason whatsoever to go out of their way to befriend and care for me and shelter me and protect me and others. And it is, it's such a phenomenal and beautiful gift, to have those people who go, actually, no strings attached. I believe in you, and we're gonna extend our tent peg, so to speak. And the funny thing is, the ironic thing to me is that actually the Bible is full of promotion of that kind of hospitality, like in the Old Testament, hospitality towards the stranger, especially the widow or the orphan, which were kind of metaphors for people who were extremely vulnerable in their life and in society at that time. Or the widow or the orphan or the foreigner. Probably in the J&D, I think it calls it an alien, but it means, someone who's totally foreign. And which is what we are when we're excommunicated. We are then find ourselves in a totally foreign world. We are like an alien, and it's bizarre that all through scripture there's this big theme of hospitality to the stranger, the foreigner, and the alien, and open-hearted generosity that should be there. It's in the New Testament too. It's just so ironic that we come from this holier than thou, wonderful, chosen God's pure people who are going to have this special tier in heaven. It's just so ironic that then we find ourselves on the outside with people who are sometimes not even Christian, who are extending us that really deep hospitality and generosity. It's what?
Yeah.
It's so
it's
upside down.
a good point you make about people who are not even Christian, because Sarah wasn't religious at all. She was born and raised an atheist, and her parents were atheists, and even her grandparents. There was no religion in that family at all. And so it wasn't like they were motivated by some better version of religion. It's just that they could see that injustice had been done, and they strongly believed in doing the right thing. And so you don't, there doesn't need to be a religious motivation for being a good person. And you don't need to be religious in any way to recognize how messed up the brethren are.
Yeah.
What greater motivation is there than just being a good person without any hope of reward for it?
Yeah.
So if we skip over, about 8 years had passed when I heard through the grapevine that Grandma Edith had cancer. Steeling myself, I called Mum and said I wanted to see Grandma one last time to say goodbye. Mum retorted, "She's not interested in seeing you." But I refused to believe that Grandma would say such a thing. I didn't blame her for not coming to the door on my visit to Invercargill. I was sure Dad had ordered her to stay inside. "If that's truly how she feels," I said to Mum, "put her on the phone and she can tell me so herself. Otherwise, I'm coming to see her, whether you like it or not." I knew this kind of tactic was par for the course from the brethren, but now that I'd spent a few years on the outside and seen how normal people interacted with their families, it seemed outrageous that my parents would try and prevent access to my dying grandmother. While Mum never put Grandma on the phone, she and Dad agreed to have a conversation with her. Eventually, Mum called me back with a compromise. Grandma would see me to say goodbye if I agreed to stay away from her brethren's funeral. She didn't want a repeat of the scenes that had unfolded at the funeral of her mother-in-law, my great-grandmother, Rhoda Hoyle, when my excommunicated Uncle Snow got in a physical altercation with church members as he tried to reach his mother's graveside. I figured I wouldn't lose anything by agreeing to avoid the funeral. It was a long way from Auckland to Invercargill, and if I was going to make the trip, I'd rather see Grandma while she was alive. Besides, I didn't think I had the strength for a graveside confrontation with all those Invercargill brethren. The memories were still too raw. My stomach was in knots when I finally made it to the hospice. This wasn't just about seeing Grandma. I was also about to see Mum for the first time since leaving Invercargill. When she met me in the car park, I noticed her hair was much greyer, but her voice hadn't changed. Hello, Craig. There was no hug. I was an evil outsider. Just a brisk greeting. Then I followed her through the front doors, wondering if she still loved me, but not daring to ask. So many unspoken questions. What's life been like for you since I left? Have you had any doubts about the brethren, or are you still convinced that Bruce Hales has a direct phone line to heaven? Do you hate me for speaking out against the church? Are you curious about what my life is like now? Grandma, asleep in bed, looked frail, her wispy white hair tucked neatly away from her forehead, and Uncle and Aunt stood guard in the corner of the room. There was no hello. My arrival met with stony silence. They watched on as Mum gently woke Grandma. Craig's here to say goodbye. Grandma half stirred. There was a hazy moment of eye contact. Goodbye, Craig, and then she drifted off again. I kissed her on the forehead. The other family members didn't say a word as I quietly wept beside the bed. They didn't care how I felt. I was no longer brethren, therefore undeserving of their sympathy. Strangely, though, although I was upset, the wrenching grief of that earlier farewell, the day Grandma and I sobbed in each other's arms, was gone. As I walked out of the hospice, I realized she had been dead to me for years. And that maybe sounds a little harsh, but it's true. And we lose these people and we go through this sort of terrible, wrenching grief. And I think it's a kind of death when you come out of the prison and you lose these people. It's a living death, and you can never fully grieve people while they're still alive, because there's still the chance that they might come back. And I've certainly had that in my life, where people that I've grieved and thought were permanently in the rearview mirror have reappeared, and I've had to dredge all those emotions back up and reintegrate those people into my life. And that's not something that everyone wants to do, and some people avoid that. But for me, with my grandma, having been through that sort of terrible, terrible farewell where we cried in each other's arms, and it, felt like my heart was breaking for her at that point, that emotion was never going to come back at quite the same level. And it wasn't until Grandma died that I realized I had already grieved losing her. But as with so many of those things, you don't know how you're going to react in these situations until they happen.
You're right though, Craig. It is incredibly complex, and it's like you go through these multiple grieving and death experiences, and so when actual death comes along, it is almost like well, I'm not trying to cause a pun, but it is like the final nail in the coffin. But the coffin is already well and truly there, and well and truly got so many nails in it already. That actual death, really is that final nail in the coffin. And I think for anybody who's like working through that kind of grief, or including the grief of losing loved ones to excommunication, resources on grief are incredibly helpful. I know it took me a number of years before I began accessing grief resources, and I think counsellors and others around me hadn't thought to recommend it, because most of them are focused on grief through death, and so because no one had died, nobody thought to recommend me that sort of resource. And yet when I came across it and did some grief courses and read grief books and stuff, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly everything that I'm going through. It's exactly the same. Like, you're bang on, Craig, when you called it a living death. There's an amazing research article. I'll see if I can send it to you, Cheryl, to put in the links, where a former Jehovah's Witness did some research into it, and they term it a social death, which I find another really helpful expression, because it actually is. You go through all the same things of grieving your life together, trying to work out a new life, all those little trigger memories, like somebody sharing a joke that you're like, oh, I'd love to share that with my sister because that would have so got her sense of humor, or wanting to share a recipe with your mum, Craig, or whatever, you guys share the love for cooking. And like, it's all those little things, just like when somebody actually dies, that we have to go through as well. And then, as you say, there's this super weird thing where people can pop up out of the grave all of a sudden. You don't know when or where. They might get excommunicated themselves, or it might be just that you see them in the street. How do you cope with that then? And then at some point there often is an actual death, especially if we're talking grandparents or parents, and all of a sudden the worlds that have been so divided do come back together again, and often we are allowed to go and visit a gravesite to say goodbye, or a bedside. So it's really complex there. There is so much grief to work through, and I definitely encourage any listeners, if you're facing that stuff, even to think about it in advance, to be aware that this is a bridge I am going to have to cross at some point. What am I going to do when my parents die? Do I wish to be notified in advance? And, for me, I took the bull by the horns with a couple of my grandparents, and much before they even got sick, I communicated to my parents and said, by the way, I love this grandparent. If they get sick, especially if it looks like they're going to die, I want you to know that I would like the opportunity to see them, to say goodbye, and I would like the opportunity to, even if possible, attend the burial or the graveside service as well. Like, communicate in advance what your wishes are. Think about it, because it's gonna happen to all of us, grandparents or parents or others. So it's
aunts and uncles.
It's worth thinking about this stuff in advance, because part of what's so hard is the shock of when it suddenly does turn up, and then you're going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do here? So and definitely access grief resources. They're really helpful.
And grief therapy, like I did years of grief therapy, and even though you can go there and as you are, and though you haven't had a physical death happen, all those courses, it really brings that intense conversation when someone like an ex-member comes forward, and we're in the grief of the living dead, right? Like, literally is what it is. But it incorporated into every grief course I took. They incorporated it in, and often changed exercises or things for me to be able to adjust to the course. And so it really helps also educate those people around us of this type of a grief. And, often I had therapists call it ambiguous grief, right? It's grief. It doesn't have an end to it like most people have. So like Lindy said, super important to find any kind of those grief therapies. And just because that you don't have a physical end death to be going there with, you really do. They will adjust their counseling for that.
We just carry on reading the book, because I think the next few pages deal with a lot of these things that we've just been talking about. Grandma Edith's death emphasized it wouldn't ever be possible for me to fully escape my brethren upbringing. Sure, I could build a new life with new friends and family and a partner and career, but moments like this would always drag me back to the agony of what I'd lost. Perhaps I could have avoided that deathbed farewell with Edith, but then it would have sat with me as an unanswered question. Was I truly ambivalent about seeing her again, or had my trauma been buried so deeply I couldn't recognize it? The only way to find out for sure was to dive back in. And it's not just deaths that prompt these reflections in people like me who have left. As the years pass, you hear that one of your siblings is married, but you weren't invited to the wedding and only found out months after the fact. People send you photos when they see your family on the street. Your nephews and nieces are born, but you'll likely never meet them. They're just names added to the family tree. They'll barely know you exist, and the few stories they hear will be about how wicked you are. People who have never been in the Brethren often expect former members to be delighted when a loved one leaves the church. They ask questions like, wouldn't it be great if your parents came to your wedding? There's an element of celebration, for sure, but while in principle we all want our families back, it can be traumatic to re-engage with people who have wounded us so badly. Lindy and I had a long conversation about this during a walk around Auckland's waterfront, grappling with the difficulty of missing people while also being hesitant about seeing them again. Realistically, my biological parents are the last people I'd want showing up at my wedding. Destroyed family relationships can't be rebuilt overnight. The grief and shock of being rejected by a brethren family member doesn't suddenly disappear if they too make an escape. I couldn't quite believe it. When my brother Caleb was excommunicated 8 years after me, he had always been a loyal member, and I vividly remembered how he'd clutched my suitcase in a bid to stop my attempt at running away. We had an awkward first meeting in TV3's News Hub Broadcasting Centre, where I was working as a senior radio reporter. He was passing through Auckland, but I was on shift and couldn't get away, so I suggested he drop past for a quick cup of tea. Caleb was on edge. This was as big a step for him as reaching out to Grandpa George had been for me. He wasn't ready to share a cup of tea and suspiciously demanded to know whether I was wearing a wire to record our conversation. I laughed and said, "You're not that interesting." He was insistent. "Can you unbutton the top of your shirt to prove it?" During those first halting attempts at reconnection, I was ambivalent about whether I wanted my brother back in my life, even though we'd been close growing up. Here, again, there was a shared connection with Lindy when her younger brother Braden was also excommunicated. We'd been through the grief of losing our siblings. Was opening our heart to them again worth the risk? I'd built a new life and wasn't sure if I wanted to make space in it for Caleb, but my boyfriend insisted. He's your family, so you need to make an effort. Still, every conversation with my brother felt like a grind. Although he was no longer walking the brethren path, he was defensive of the church and wouldn't hear a bad word said about the man of God. I struggled to make sense of Caleb's beliefs. He clearly accepted he didn't fit with the brethren lifestyle, yet still believed Bruce Hales was a very special man and even had a picture of him on his bedroom wall. Caleb and I were distrustful of each other. I hadn't forgotten his part in my rejection, and he was angry for the pain my leaving had caused the family. It was traumatic to hear his stories of how they'd suffered. I'd always known I'd hurt my parents and siblings, a cost I accepted as part of leaving, but now it was no longer abstract. As I drove Caleb to job interviews, and we had long, difficult conversations over drinks, whiskey, of course, I heard how he felt I'd tarnished our family's standing in the brethren. For years, he'd been embarrassed to tell people his surname when he travelled to church meetings outside Invercargill. And Mum, poor Mum. Behind the cold rejection, she'd been devastated to lose her eldest son. She had wept at the assembly meeting when my excommunication was discussed and walked out because it was too much to bear. This knowledge was crushing. I squirmed with embarrassment as I observed Caleb's fresh inexperience in the outside world and realized I must have seemed equally wet behind the ears when I first left the brethren. I remembered those early forays into dating and applying for my first worldly jobs. Had I really stuck out as such a strange outsider? When I asked friends, they laughed fondly. Yes, they said, but it wasn't surprising considering your background, and it was obvious you wanted to learn as fast as possible. Then there was the inflated ego that came with growing up in the brethren, which I only recognized in myself with hindsight. When you've been told your whole life that you're one of the privileged few with special access to power and intellect, it's easy to carry that arrogance into the outside world. It can be a hard landing when you collide with the realization that you're no better than anyone else. Rebuilding my relationship with Caleb was a long, slow task. We agreed that if we weren't siblings, we wouldn't bother putting in the effort to keep in touch. There were just too many things we disagreed on, and he didn't fit naturally into any part of my life. I was also agonizing over letting myself have feelings for my brother after so many years of telling myself I'd never see him again. The evening before I left New Zealand to move overseas, following my then boyfriend on a years-long work relocation, we were at a cousin's house for dinner. It was a farewell party with people I loved, and I choked up when Caleb arrived. How could I leave my brother behind for a second time when he'd only just come back into my life? After the meal, we had a quiet moment to ourselves beside the bookshelf, but I struggled to find the words for how I was feeling. He asked me, "Would you like to go outside for some fresh air?" I'd been keeping it together, but as soon as we got past the front door, away from watchful eyes, my heart crumbled. There were no words. Caleb and I burst into tears, and I threw my arms around him. I would never have admitted it, but it turned out I still loved my brother very much. And it just comes back to that point where we're talking about how you never know how you will react in a situation until it happens. And before that moment, I would have said that I didn't love my brother anymore. And it turned out that it just took the right trigger to get there. And there were all these feelings that were locked away so tightly that I sort of stopped even being aware that they were there. And I think that's one of the really challenging things after you come out of the Brethren is you don't know, no matter how well processed you feel, you never know when you're going to find another hidden trunk or a hidden drawer that's locked or something. And suddenly the key comes along and opens it and it all comes rushing out at you.
Yeah. Which is, it's so true for human beings, right? And for all of us, it's a really good way of describing it, that all of us have got these, hurts that are locked away. And it makes so much sense that for you were afraid to love your brother again and afraid to welcome him back into your life. Of course, that makes sense because, that part of you would have been afraid of losing him again. What if he turns around and goes back to the Brethren, and, you're trying to protect your heart. So it makes so much sense that you felt that ambivalence or that resistance towards embracing him fully again. And what a beautiful description, though, of you allowing yourself to feel that pain and that vulnerability, and that he could meet you. I love that he could meet you in that place. He didn't just ridicule you or walk away or whatever, but to describe that, you were able to kind of embrace and meet each other in that raw vulnerability. That's really, really beautiful.
I mean, for anyone who's wondering, yes, we are still in touch and we're much closer now than we were then. And we have massively different views on things and we don't, but we're in that space that you're in with family where you're close because you're family, not for any other reason. And I think that's really important. And it's like, we don't have to have the same beliefs and we don't have to agree on everything. Like, it's actually fine for us to negotiate that relationship and figure out where we're on the same page and where we aren't on the same page. And sometimes we'll talk about the things where we're not on the same page, and some of them we'll just agree to disagree and move on, and that's okay too. And that's that's the opposite of the Brethren idea where everybody has to agree on everything. No, you actually don't.
Yes, oh my gosh, Craig, that's such a key and relevant weird thing about reconnecting with former brethren, whether they're relatives or not. It's that thing of it's like our whole history in the Brethren has taught us not to relate with people who believe or think differently from us. And so that can be a really strange thing to navigate, especially with family members, because it's like there's still this part of you that thinks, oh, we still need to believe the same, walk the same, live the same, talk the same. And so when you realize that, oh, we don't think the same and live the same, how then do we have relationship with each other? Because some of us can accept our neighbours or our colleagues having different beliefs and that we can still be friendly with them. But it's another step again when it's a family member to be like, okay, how do I navigate this territory? Like, can I still have a meal with you when we have got different lifestyles or we vote differently? Like, it's genuinely a new social relational pathway that we have to form in our brains of how do we do this?
And it's possible to do.
And you can have different views on things without being horrible about it. And also, if someone says something that you don't agree with, you don't even have to tell them what you think. It is okay to just let it go and say, that's an interesting perspective, and move on. You don't have to say that you disagree with it. You don't have to tell them they're wrong. You don't have to say, well, this is what it actually is. Or it's it can just wash past you. Or rather than saying you're wrong, because you can say, well, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And, another way of looking at it and something that I've thought about is X, Y, Z, because then you can offer an alternative perspective without throwing their perspective back in their face. I mean, this is a learning journey for all of us, and I get it wrong all the time. And I still have arguments with people, or sometimes I have a bad day and I don't have the emotional capacity that I might have on other days. And so some days I'll listen, and some days I might get in an argument, and some days I might just tell them to fuck off. And any one of those paths, if you have a solid relationship with them, can be navigated. And you don't have to come at these relationships from this place where you have to be on the same page about the same things all the time. Otherwise, there is no relationship. Like, I think in a normal, healthy family relationship, there's a lot of scope for disagreement and tension without it seriously threatening the relationship. And that can be really confronting to live with.
And I think what the brethren take away from us growing up is the act of being curious, right? When you're allowed to stay curious about everything and anything, you have more of an open mind when you are in conversations that go against maybe what you believe. But because you've been taught that it's okay to be curious, you can be curious about that other person's perspective and it doesn't cause hostility. It opens up just beautiful conversations. But in the brethren growing up, you have that taken away. You're not allowed to be curious in conversations. You're not allowed to ask questions or just have that state of calmness and curiosity.
And them believing what they believe does not threaten you and what you believe. And you don't have to interpret it as a challenge to what you believe. We encounter this all the time at work, but as a journalist, and we are expected to go out and talk to like the full spread of humanity and people with wildly different views. And as a journalist, that you're constantly put in these positions where you're having to interview and talk to people who you wildly disagree with, but then like fairly and accurately represent what they say and how they feel. And that's a constant, you're walking a line with that. And sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong. And then you learn from the times when you get it wrong. But the ability to talk to people you don't agree with is a critical skill, I think, for people coming out of the brethren.
Yeah. And it's quite hard to learn because we genuinely have no tools for how to do it. We've not been role modeled it.
I have sticky notes around my house that say, stay curious, right? Because that mind is very easily can come in.
Yeah. And it's like, it's possible to have negative feelings toward, family member. It's possible to have negative feelings towards them in the moment, but not have that detract from the overall love and support you feel towards them. I remember, so this was my partner at the time, and it was really difficult rebuilding a relationship with my brother. And I would, you bit to moan. And this is the thing, like, loving someone doesn't mean you can't bit to moan about them sometimes. Although there's a mature way of doing it. But I would complain about things that were happening with my brother and talk a bit of shit about him and say, "You never believe what he did this time." And I'd say this to my partner at the time. But then as soon as my partner said something negative about my brother, I would like immediately get defensive and be like, "I can talk shit about my family, but you can't."
Yeah, sweet.
All right, so we're pretty much at the end of the book now. We're on to the last chapter, chapter 16. I'm losing count. Yes, 16.
Yeah.
And this is a very short chapter that deals with the death of Grandpa George. So this is my grandpa Lindy's great uncle. And we'll just pick in halfway through the chapter. As Grandpa lay dying, Kate, Lindy, and I agonized over how and when to tell the brethren side of the family. There was no predicting how they'd react. We'd heard horror stories about brethren relatives swooping on deathbeds to assert control one last time. On the other hand, it was respectful to let them know. And how could we demand they tell us about our brethren loved ones if we didn't afford them the same courtesy? "I'm feeling it's important to let them know soon," wrote Lindy in an email suggesting we break the news to Grandpa's son. "Shall I call Patrick?" And then, a short time later, "I've called Patrick. He was good about it, really." When I later called Mum to ask if she'd like to pay final respects to her dad, she wasn't interested. Grandpa's brethren family had been absent in life for 38 years, and now they were absent in death, all except Patrick. George's son was the only brethren family member who came to pay his respects. I found it bizarre to see Patrick at the hospital almost daily, after he had effectively ignored his father for almost 4 decades. Lindy, Kate, and I had to awkwardly explain to ICU staff why George's son was showing up, but avoiding family conferences about end-of-life care that fell instead to a grandson and 2 nieces. Patrick, a bachelor in his 50s, somewhat of an anomaly in the brethren, was polite yet distant. After their encounter during the review, Grandpa had called him from time to time, but had become fed up by the one-sided communication. Why am I always the one calling you? How come you never call me? We'd call if we were worried about you. How long would that take? Oh, probably about 5 years. Just taking a moment here to say how utterly abnormal that is, to say that you wouldn't start getting worried about a family member until you hadn't heard from them for 5 years. Grandpa, in a fit of frustration, had sat back to put Patrick to the test. Months had passed, and then a year, then 2. The 5-year threshold came and went. There was no call. Now, here was Patrick at Grandpa's deathbed, acting as though he cared about his dad. It left a bad taste in my mouth. Grandpa George's apartment laid bare, a life interrupted. There was food in the fridge, paperwork on his desk, and laundry waiting to be washed. He could have walked through the door at any moment and put the kettle on, digging through the cupboard for his famous chocolate biscuits. Lindy, Kate, and I felt like voyeurs as we spent 2 weeks dipping into the unsanitized pool of his life. There was barely room to move in his small man cave, dust flying as we dislodged boxes that hadn't moved for decades. Lindy's month-old son went in the bath because there was nowhere else for the baby carrier. We were astonished to discover that Grandpa had meticulously recorded his entire life. He had kept a carbon copy of every letter, printed every important email, and even made notes of important telephone conversations. All were methodically dated, sometimes with additional reflective notes. The past came alive through yellowed diaries, press clippings, and photographs. It was all there. George's troubled childhood with a widowed mother, his whirlwind courtship with Lottie, and his brutal excommunication. There, too, were his parents' life's records. Alf and Ruth's courtship letters, journals, scribblings, and the agony of Alf's death when George was a child. Even earlier letters told stories of George's own grandfather's excommunication and the chaos it had wrought. Stories of family members who had joined a fledgling religious movement back in England 200 years ago, believing in it so strongly that they travelled as missionaries and ended up in New Zealand. A cacophonous, ghostly chorus shouted from the pages with grief, pain, and joy. That's the end of the book, although there is an epilogue, which is as long as a chapter. So if we just go through the epilogue, which is wrapping up what's happening in the Brethren now and what's happened in my life since. So jumping in a few pages, Bruce Hales has learnt the hard way that scrutiny can't be avoided. In June 2012, the Charity Commission for England and Wales declined to grant charitable status to the Preston Down Trust, an exclusive Brethren charity running church meeting rooms, finding that the sect's doctrine and practices contained elements of detriment and harm, in an echo of the Commission's 1970s inquiry into the Brethren, which had concluded that the doctrine of separation was harsh and harmful. In their attempt to retain charitable status in the UK, the Brethren published a new Faith and Practice Charter. Trust deeds were updated to reflect this document, which outlines how the Brethren will supposedly care for the welfare of excommunicated members. Where persons seek to leave the community, reasonable assistance should be afforded to them in terms of support and/or financial assistance relating to employment or other matters, where they have been dependent on the community for that support. The Faith and Practice document also states that the Brethren principle of separation permits interpersonal communication and social interaction with non-Brethren, including former Brethren. Members and recent leavers I speak with dismiss this as a legal fiction and not accurate. One person still in the church tells me, anyone who was found to be associating with outsiders with any friendliness or familiarity would be quickly alienated from the social lives of other Brethren. But the lofty promises were enough for the Commission. Charitable status was restored to the Preston Down Trust in January 2014. Later that year, in October 2014, the Brethren launched a charitable arm called the Rapid Relief Team, with international branches soon popping up around the world. Brethren volunteers now distribute food parcels to disaster victims, raise funds for homeless shelters, and provide free catering to emergency services. A good amount of it is political, basically, says a recent leaver, who tells me that the Rapid Relief Team is little more than a publicity stunt. They now describe themselves worldwide as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, and a member laughs when I ask why. They needed the rebrand. Behind closed doors, Brethren members know that what is promised to outside investigators and what is practiced within the church are two different things. In leaked notes from a March 2022 meeting in Sydney, Bruce Hales explicitly forbids his followers from interacting with persons that are opposing the truth, despite the assurances given to British Charity Commission investigators. We can't have anything to do with them, Hales is quoted as saying at that meeting. You don't greet them, don't even greet them, don't have to, there's no obligation to do it. And I think bits like this just emphasize the hypocrisy that's still going on in the Brethren, and I think speak to the dishonesty of the faith and practice charter that they've agreed to. This whole idea that there's nothing stopping the Brethren from having social contact with former members. Under the terms of this faith and practice charter, there's nothing stopping any of our families from reaching out and talking to us and inviting us into their homes, and yet we know that's not happening. And I think there is a massive dishonesty around saying this is what we do officially, and this is what we actually do behind closed doors.
Oh my gosh, it's unbelievably dishonest and unethical, in terms of what's good character. And it sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier around that like major presumptuousness, that arrogance around, like they know that they only agree to that stuff because they were forced to legally to keep their charitable status, or that's what it appears, and they're happy to do that because keeping charitable status is really important to them. So they're happy to kind of do that, but to then actually behind the scenes not stick to it. And there's been so many dodgy accounts around things like that, to do with the rapid relief team, like that they were legally required to show that document to every household or every person in the Brethren in the UK, and yet I've heard multiple accounts of people saying that they never saw it, or that I think it was meant to be displayed in their meeting room pinboards for a while, and yet it sounds like that didn't happen often. There's so much stuff that seems so evasive there in terms of hiding the faith and practice document from Brethren, even in the UK. That's what it looks like. But it comes back to that sort of arrogance thing of like, we were strong-armed into doing this and we don't actually really believe in it. And, of course, they also argue that was just in the UK, so it's not applicable around the rest of the world, even though, on the other hand, we know that they teach that they're a universal position with universally held practices and doctrines. And so it's like, well, if you agreed to that there, and Bruce Hales signed that thing that's publicly available, that he witnessed, that he signed it, so why is that not, the universal standard? Confusing.
So there's always in every podcast a link to that Preston Down Trust, the whole faith and practice document. I'll attach, make sure underneath here, right at the very top, I'll attach it again. It's super important for the insiders to read it and know what you have rights to and what they assigned, agreed to. As for the RRT, right? I mean, we all know, we sit out here at the hypocrisy of it. I mean, them even attending the Are You Okay stuff, right? That's Mental Health Day. When we had a teacher come on and actually say that they tried accessing those specific mental health services and were denied it. The kid got into trouble for it, right? So I think for all of us ex-members, the hypocrisy of what RRT shows up to, often they're showing up to something that they have created an issue with themselves as part of their indoctrination.
Remember this is not long ago, a recent leaver messaged me very upset. This was a father who had just lost his 5 kids and then went on LinkedIn to see the Brethren or RRT posting on Father's Day about the importance of valuing father's relationship with the children. And it's like, well, they just took away my 5 children.
Yeah.
Which is, it's kind of deeply painful.
That irony is deeply painful. And for me, when they first started rolling out this stuff, it was the tagline that they've got, which I believe is community, compassion and support, that I found particularly galling, when all of us who have been made to leave or who have chosen to leave you know, community, compassion, and support are the very three things that we have had absolutely not a skerrick of. And so it's super galling to see them willing to go out there and give it to strangers when they won't give it to those of us who are actually suffering because of what they have done. And when Olive Leaf began, we actually wrote to the RRT at one point and asked if they would partner with us, you know, because, we noticed in some of their literature that they got a heavy focus on relief of poverty and, you know, help with people experiencing vulnerability and homelessness and things like this. And I looked at it and I was like, these are all the things that people contacting Olive Leaf are struggling with, trying to figure out their accommodation, trying to get employment, trying to rebuild their lives made vulnerable through your church. And so I wrote to them an open letter. It can be found on the internet saying, hey guys, can we sit down and chat? Can you partner with us? Can you give us food boxes to give to people who are made vulnerable through leaving your church? And we just never heard back from them, which I thought was really rude, considering that their tagline is community, compassion and support. So RRT people, we'd still love to hear from you.
And I'll attach a copy of that letter in this podcast so they can see it.
This is the thing, like if the brethren want to come back and have a genuine conversation about how to support people who leave, which they say they are committed to in their faith and practice document, all of us would be very open to having that dialogue with them about what they can do to better make sure that people are supported. And just to make the point here as well, like one of the accusations that often gets thrown around is that those of us who have left can only speak to what the brethren were like up until the point that we left. And the pushback is often, well, we've changed since then, or that's not what we practice now, or the idea that somehow our knowledge about what's happening in the brethren is out of date because we haven't been in there recently. And I always push back really strongly on that point because I think in a way those of us on the outside often have more of an idea of what's going on inside there because insiders are telling us and they're being honest with what they think and honest with what they're experiencing. And same thing, like all the way through the book here, where I'm talking, particularly in the epilogue, where I'm talking about what is still happening in the brethren, there were multiple insiders who agreed to be interviewed for this book and who obviously anonymously, and I've been really careful not to identify them, but there were multiple insiders who felt that this was important enough that they were willing to risk doing an interview with me, an opposer, a journalist, for the purposes of describing what things are like in there now and like backing up the narrative of this book. It puts the lie to the idea that they've changed because you talk to people on the inside and you're like, I just want to run this back past you to see if this is still happening. And that often not only is it still happening, but it's somehow worse.
Yeah,
Totally.
I'm going to read something really quick that I received from an insider just the other day. So this was to do with their schooling system. And when we talk about things getting worse, this fits in perfectly. They have also recently banned access to any time-wasting websites, programs, etc. on the school computers. Kids are no longer allowed to play games on school devices at school in order to be prepared for the working world. This also affects things like playing chess, reading, etc. to unwind. Anything not schoolwork related is banned and will be blocked by teachers using a program called Dino, which allows them to see our screens 24/7 and block any websites they don't want us on, as well as frequent streamlined 3 screenshots sent to campus principals, brethren community leaders in school, and parents if the system flags anything. Well, I have to say, I never had that going in there. And so it definitely has not gotten better since I left, and I left in 1992. So that seems like things have gotten way worse since 1992. So if things have changed, it's definitely changed in more of a lockdown situation instead of being this.
Well, that's exactly like the John Hoyle system days of like, you are not allowed any downtime and you've got to account for every minute of your day, be doing something productive. It's terrible. And like, you know, people might I say, you're allowed to rest, like even from a Christian perspective, God rested, Jesus rested. Like, man, I just can't stand that endless productivity pressure. It's terrible. It's not healthy for you. people take a rest, go and lie down for 5 minutes and look at the clouds float by in the blue sky. Don't feel guilty about it. Go and rest, you poor things.
Or play chess if that's really what you want to do.
Exactly.
Gosh, play chess, like play games, enjoy each other. Like what a horrific way to live under. And again, it reminds me of the novel 1984. Like go and read it, people. But where every minute's being counted and you're just part of a machine that's just grinding away and you're just being watched. It's not the way things are meant to be.
As we said in a previous podcast, like often the brethren will fixate on which rules apply now and which rules are different. But again, it's not about what the specific rules are at this point in time. It's about the system of control that's underlying them. And that system of control hasn't changed. That's what's getting worse. And Bruce Hales might be using different rules and different techniques to enforce that control over members, but it's there and just as strong as it ever was. And it's been going on for 200 years, which I think takes us neatly to a bit at the end of the epilogue, which I think sort of sums up this project. 2 centuries have passed since Sam Childs was first attracted to a fledgling religious movement in England. I wonder what my great-great-great-grandfather would make of it all. The missionaries, the excommunications, the demands for blind loyalty, 200 years of a family divided with both sides convinced of their truth. Now, Lindy's children will likely grow up not knowing their grandparents, an 8th generation affected by brethren dogma. When Lindy and I reflect on that intergenerational trauma, 8 generations of grief and loss, she takes a long pause and stares into the distance before she says, "It makes me deeply sad that the fingers of this group have been able to reach across so many generations and leave such huge claw marks and disfigurement across families. I'm still confused at how intelligent people can remain so deeply enmeshed within such an abusive system." I nod and reply, "It's so complicated as well. It's not just one arc, like our great-grandparents, Alf and Ruth, deciding to go back after having spent most of their lives criticizing the exclusive brethren, and the cognitive dissonance that has run through the generations. Alf and Ruth's grave lies in an unkempt corner of Wellington's Karori Cemetery, tucked into a non-aligned hillside between the Anglicans and Catholics. Weeds grow through cracks in the concrete, and a 10-foot pittosporum clings to its vantage point inside a neighbouring grave. I sit and ponder on a sunny summer afternoon. How would Alf feel about the brethren's strict separation doctrine? Did Ruth ever regret cutting off all her siblings? Would they even recognise what the brethren have become? How would they feel about the secret correspondence between Anna, their bright-eyed daughter, and George, their excommunicated son? Ruth's decisions still ripple across much earlier decisions from her parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. My journey of family discovery has lasted years. Using Grandpa George's meticulous records as a springboard, I've collected documents and photographs, pieced together conflicting accounts, and interviewed dozens of relatives and former brethren members, trying to make sense of it all. There's poignant grief among those I speak with, but also joy. Hundreds of pages of transcripts contain more laughter than tears. You could actually write quite an interesting book on it, says my great-uncle Alan, Lottie's younger brother, when we reflect on how generations of brethren stories weave together in a complex tapestry. Maybe you will one day. And here we are. Yeah, and that last bit at the end, and that's not quite the end of the book, but I think that's a good place to end it for this podcast, because again, as I said at the beginning of the first podcast where we started talking about this book, it was really important to me that the book was not just my story, it's our story, it's our collective story. It's what's happened to our family over 200 years, and making the point that what has happened to me and to both of you and to all of us is not unique, and it's been going on for a really long time. And as I talk about in the book, going back as far as the 1850s, there were issues in our family over the splits between open and exclusive and what it meant to be brethren. And so this is like an incredibly long time that this has been playing out in our family and in the brethren more broadly. And so the idea now that the brethren are any different to what they have been for a very long time is, in my view, just not accurate. And I really hope that this book is a useful part of explaining to people what that history is. And I think a lot of that history is missing, even for a lot of people who are in the Brethren. They don't know what the history is, or they've been told such a sanitized version of it, that there's not an adequate understanding of what it is and what it means. And I really hope that this book helps people explore some of those things and understand where they came from, even if they don't want to do anything further with that information. I hope it's useful.
And if you're inside, start asking questions about those that have been excommunicated you don't talk about in the family. Just try and find different ways to have conversations. You might be shocked. And I think a lot of I've had quite a few insiders reach out to me where they actually are making somewhere with their families just by starting to have conversations. Like it's a different time right now with everything being exposed, and those people who have had to really tuck away their trauma, bringing it out sometimes is a relief for people. It doesn't mean anybody needs to leave. It doesn't mean just that you're leaving. It just means bringing out this stuff and having those healthy conversations. You might not know what could happen.
Yeah.
And for those people who do want someone to talk to, sometimes the safest person to talk to is someone on the outside. There's much less risk. And this is, I think a lot of people on the inside who are curious or talking to people on the outside don't fully comprehend how many other people are doing the same thing. And those of us on the outside, I think, have a much better picture of what's going on and of how many people are unhappy because they're all talking to us, but they're not talking to each other because it's not safe.
Yeah.
So when we tell you that the Brethren are full of people who don't believe in BDH and who are talking to outsiders and are actively passing on information because they're so concerned about what's going on, we're not making it up. It's true, and you're not alone. Like, if you're having doubts, there are so many other people who are with you in those doubts, but they don't dare speak them within the Brethren. And so I think be comfortable sitting with those doubts and be comfortable having them and allow yourself to acknowledge them. And as I've said on this podcast before, like, something for me when I was a teenager is the Bible talks about how even Jesus sat in the temple at the age of 12 asking questions.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with asking questions, either as a human or as a Christian. And this whole idea that you shouldn't question things is a gross distortion of doctrine because it suits the Brethren's purposes. There's no other reason for it.
Yeah.
And if you're inside and needing help, you can always reach out to the Olive Leaf Network. Always available for you for some sort of advice. For those that are wanting to share stories or wanting to come on, you can contact us at info.getalife@proton.me. I really appreciate you, Craig, taking out all this time, and Lindy sitting with us. And Craig, your book was such a journey. You have a box of Kleenex beside you when you read it, but also be prepared for the laughs because they're both there. It's not just all sad stories. There is it's just so much information. It takes you on such a journey. So thank you. Thank you to the both for coming on, doing 3 parts of this. I thank everybody for their patience as we work through all these podcasts. They're well worth listening to.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Cheryl. Keep up the great work. And if you can get a hold of the book, people, I do recommend it. It's there's so much that we actually haven't covered in these stories. Yeah. And it's the kind of book that it could be one line or one paragraph that really jumps out at you and goes, oh my gosh, that's the same as what I experienced. Yeah. And we have genuinely, even though these podcasts have been long, we have genuinely probably only shared a third of the book, or let me say. So do get hold of the book if or when you can. Otherwise we hope you've enjoyed listening to us reflect, and leave us a comment if you can, or get in touch. We do love hearing feedback from these podcasts.
And the link to all the where you can buy the books in all the different countries will be below. On our website, we actually have them on the website that takes you to all the different countries and where they go. So you can easy access, get it from there. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Thanks,
Stay
everyone.
safe.
Okay.
Take care. Much love to you all.
See you later. Bye.
Bye. How can you support Get a Life podcast? You can donate internationally via PayPal at www.paypal.me/getalifepodcast. PayPal also has a QR code that can be scanned. Or donate to our Get a Life podcast GoFundMe. If you're in a high-demand religious group and need help, please go to oliveleaf.network. To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me. Check out www.get-a-life.net for Get a Life merchandise, books, and ways to support or get support. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to Get a Life, and comment.